It was evening. A lone servant waited for the rain to stop beneath the Rashomon gate. Under the expansive gate, there was no one else but this man. Only a cricket perched on one of the large pillars, where the red paint had peeled in places. Since Rashomon was located on Suzaku Avenue, it wouldn't be unusual for 2 or 3 people wearing straw hats or black eboshi to seek shelter from the rain. However, in reality, there was no one but this man. The reason for this was that in the past 2 or 3 years, Kyoto had been struck by a series of disasters such as earthquakes, tornadoes, fires, and famines. As a result, the decay of Kyoto was extraordinary. According to old records, people broke statues and Buddhist implements, piling the wood with red paint and gold or silver leaf by the roadside to sell as firewood. Given the state of Kyoto, no one cared about repairing Rashomon. Taking advantage of its dilapidated condition, foxes and tanuki settled in, and thieves made it their home. Eventually, it became customary to bring unclaimed corpses to this gate and abandon them. Thus, as night fell, everyone became uneasy and avoided coming near the gate. Instead, countless crows gathered from who knows where. During the day, these crows formed circles, flying and cawing around the high shibi, especially when the sky above the gate turned red with the sunset. They could be seen clearly, as if sesame seeds were scattered. The crows, of course, came to peck at the flesh of the corpses on the gate. Yet today, perhaps because it was late, not a single crow was to be seen. Only the white droppings of crows were visible, sticking here and there on the stone steps, which were crumbling in places with long grass growing from the cracks. The servant, sitting on the top of the 7 stone steps with the hem of his washed-out navy kimono spread out, absent-mindedly watched the rain fall while worrying about a large pimple on his right cheek. Earlier, the author wrote, the servant was waiting for the rain to stop. However, the servant had no particular plan even if the rain stopped. Normally, he would return to his master's house, but 4 or 5 days ago, he had been dismissed by his master. As previously mentioned, the city of Kyoto was in a state of decline at the time. The servant being dismissed by his long-serving master was merely a small ripple of this decline. Therefore, it would be more accurate to say, the servant, trapped by the rain, was at a loss with nowhere to go, rather than, the servant was waiting for the rain to stop. Moreover, today's weather had a significant impact on the emotions of this Heian period servant. The rain, which began after the hour of the monkey, showed no sign of stopping. Consequently, the servant, trying to figure out how to survive tomorrow, trying to make something out of nothing, was lost in thought, listening absent-mindedly to the sound of the rain falling on Suzaku Avenue. The rain enveloped Rashomon, gathering sound from afar with a roar. The evening darkness gradually lowered the sky, and looking up, the roof of the gate, with its protruding tiles, seemed to support the heavy, dim clouds. To make something out of nothing, there was no time to choose means. If he chose, he would only starve to death under the soil or on the roadside. Then, he would be carried to the top of this gate and discarded like a dog. If he did not choose, after going back and forth along the same path many times, the servant finally reached this conclusion. However, this if remained unresolved, never progressing beyond if. While acknowledging the necessity of not choosing, means the servant lacked the courage to actively accept the inevitable conclusion of becoming a thief. The servant sneezed loudly and then stood up reluctantly. The evening chill in Kyoto was cold enough to make one wish for a brazier. The wind blew unreservedly between the pillars of the gate, along with the evening darkness. The cricket that had perched on the vermilion pillar had already gone somewhere else. The servant, hunching his shoulders, raised the shoulders of his navy kimono layered over a yellow sweat-stained undergarment, and looked around the gate. If there was a place where he could avoid the rain and wind, without worrying about being seen and sleep safely for the night, he thought he would spend the night there. Fortunately, his eyes fell on a wide, vermilion-painted ladder leading up to the tower above the gate. If there were people up there, they would only be corpses anyway. The servant, careful not to let the sword at his waist slip from its scabbard, placed his straw-sandaled foot on the bottom rung of the ladder. Then, after a while, it happened. In the middle of the wide ladder leading up to the Rashomon tower, a man crouched like a cat, holding his breath and peering at the scene above. The faint light of a fire leaking from the tower above faintly illuminated the man's right cheek. It was a cheek with a red, pus-filled pimple among short whiskers. The servant had assumed from the start that only corpses would be up there. However, after climbing 2 or 3 rungs of the ladder, he realized that someone was lighting a fire above and moving it around. This was evident from the way the murky yellow light flickered across the cobweb-covered ceiling. Since someone was lighting a fire on this rainy night atop Rashomon, they were surely no ordinary person. The servant, moving as stealthily as a gecko, finally crawled his way up the steep ladder to the topmost rung. Then, flattening his body as much as possible, he craned his neck forward and cautiously peered into the tower. As he looked, he saw that, just as the rumors had said, several corpses were carelessly discarded inside the tower. However, because the reach of the firelight was narrower than he had expected, he couldn't determine the exact number. He could only vaguely discern that there were both naked corpses and clothed ones among them. Of course, it seemed that both women and men were mixed in. And these corpses, with their mouths agape and limbs sprawled, lay scattered on the floor, resembling clay dolls so much that one might doubt they had ever been living humans. Furthermore, they remained eternally silent, with the firelight faintly illuminating the raised parts like shoulders and chests, casting even darker shadows on the lower parts. The servant instinctively covered his nose against the stench of the rotting corpses. Yet, in the next moment, he forgot to keep his hand there. A powerful emotion had almost entirely robbed him of his sense of smell. It was then that the servant's eyes first noticed a human figure crouching among the corpses. It was an old woman, short and thin, with white hair, wearing a robe the color of cypress bark. She held a lit pinewood splinter in her right hand and was peering intently at the face of one of the corpses. Judging by the long hair, it was likely a woman's corpse. Driven by 60% fear and 40% curiosity, the servant momentarily forgot even to breathe. To borrow the words of an ancient chronicler, he felt as if the hair on his body stood on end. Then the old woman, after wedging the pinewood splinter into a gap in the floorboards, placed her hands on the neck of the corpse she had been examining and began plucking its long hair one strand at a time, as if a mother monkey picking lice from her young. The hair seemed to come away easily in her hands. As each strand of hair was plucked, the fear gradually faded from the servant's heart. Simultaneously, an intense hatred for the old woman began to well up within him. No, it might be misleading to say it was directed at the old woman. Rather, his aversion to all evil grew stronger with each passing moment. If someone had, at that moment, reminded the servant of the dilemma he had pondered beneath the gate, whether to starve to death or become a thief, he would likely have chosen starvation without hesitation. Such was the intensity of his hatred for evil, burning fiercely like the pinewood splinter the old woman had wedged into the floor. Naturally, the servant could not comprehend why the old woman was plucking the hair of the dead. Therefore, he couldn't rationally classify the act as good or evil. However, to the servant, the very act of plucking the hair of the dead on this rainy night atop Rashomon already felt like an unforgivable evil. Of course, he had completely forgotten that he himself had been contemplating becoming a thief just moments before. With that, the servant gathered strength in his legs and suddenly leaped up the ladder. Grasping the hilt of his sword, he strode with large steps toward the old woman. Needless to say, the old woman was startled. At the sight of the servant, the old woman leapt up as if she had been shot from a bow. "Where do you think you're going?" The servant blocked the old woman's path as she stumbled over the corpses, trying to flee in a panic, and he berated her. The old woman still tried to push past him. The servant, determined not to let her go, pushed her back. The two of them grappled silently among the corpses for a while. However, the outcome was clear from the start. The servant finally grabbed the old woman's arm and forcibly pulled her down. Her arm was nothing but skin and bones, like a chicken's leg. "What were you doing? Speak. If you don't, this is what will happen." The servant released the old woman, then suddenly drew his sword from its sheath and thrust the white steel blade in front of her eyes. But the old woman remained silent. Her hands trembled, her shoulders heaved with breath, and her eyes were wide open, as if she had lost the power of speech, stubbornly keeping silent. Seeing this, the servant realized for the first time that the old woman's life or death was entirely in his hands. This realization unexpectedly cooled the intense hatred that had been burning within him. What remained was only a serene satisfaction and pride in having accomplished a task successfully. So, looking down at the old woman, he softened his voice slightly and said, "I am not an officer of the police. I am a traveler who happened to pass under this gate. Therefore, I have no intention of binding you up or doing anything to you. I just want you to tell me what you were doing up here on this gate." The old woman widened her already large eyes and stared intently at the servant's face. Her eyes were red and sharp, like those of a bird of prey. Her lips, almost merged with her nose due to wrinkles, moved as if chewing something. Her thin throat moved, and her pointed Adam's apple bobbed up and down. Then, from that throat, a voice like a crow's caw, gasping for breath, reached the servant's ears. "I was pulling out this hair, you see, pulling out this hair to make a wig." The servant was disappointed that the old woman's answer was more mundane than he had expected. And with that disappointment, the cold disdain, along with the previous hatred, crept back into his heart. Perhaps this feeling was conveyed to the old woman, still holding the long strands of hair she had taken from the corpse's head in one hand, and she muttered in a voice like a toad's croak, "Indeed, pulling hair from a corpse might be considered a bad thing. But all the dead here are people who deserve at least that much. The woman whose hair I pulled just now used to cut snakes into 4-inch pieces, dry them, and sell them as dried fish to the samurai camps. If she hadn't died of the plague, she would still be selling them. And they say the samurai always bought her dried fish, saying it was delicious. I don't think what she did was wrong. She did it out of necessity to avoid starving to death. So I don't think what I'm doing now is wrong either. It's also something I have to do to avoid starving to death. Therefore, this woman, who understood the necessity of such things, would surely overlook what I'm doing." The old woman said something to this effect. The servant calmly listened to her story while sheathing his sword and holding its hilt with his left hand. Of course, he listened while being conscious of the large, red, swollen pimple on his right hand. However, as he listened to the story, a certain courage began to grow within him. It was the courage that had been lacking in him earlier under the gate. And it was a courage that was inclined to move in the completely opposite direction from when he had climbed up to the gate and captured the old woman. The servant was not only undecided between starving to death or becoming a thief, but from his state of mind at that time, the thought of starving to death was almost entirely pushed out of his consciousness. "I see, so that's how it is." When the old woman's story ended, the servant confirmed in a voice that seemed to mock her. Then, stepping forward, he suddenly released his right hand from his pimple and seized the old woman's collar, speaking in a biting tone. "Then don't blame me if I rob you. If I don't do this, I'll starve to death." The servant swiftly stripped the old woman of her kimono. As she tried to cling to his legs, he roughly kicked her onto the corpse. The distance to the top of the ladder was only about 5 steps. Clutching the stripped-off hinoki-colored kimono under his arm, the servant dashed down the steep ladder into the darkness of the night in an instant. It was shortly after that when the old woman, who had been lying as if dead, raised her naked body from among the corpses. Muttering and groaning, she crawled to the top of the ladder, relying on the light of the still-burning fire. From there, she let her short white hair hang down and peered under the gate. Outside, only the pitch-black night stretched endlessly. No one knows where the servant went.